The frost was still on the fence rails that Tuesday morning in October 1961 when I saw his truck idling at the end of my drive, headlights cutting through the dark like he'd been there a while. $22 a hundredweight, cash, and he wanted first pick before anybody else in Caldwell County got a look at my hogs. I stood in the doorway of the barn with a bucket of skim milk and bread scraps going cold in my hands, watching him climb out of that green Ford and stamp his boots against the cold, and I thought about the last time he'd stood on my property. That was March, and he hadn't even gotten out of his truck, just rolled the window down enough to tell me he didn't buy from boys running their granddaddy's place into the ground, and that I should save us both the trouble and call the bank before the bank called me. Now here he was, at 5:40 in the morning, with a checkbook in his coat pocket, and behind him, 2 more trucks idling on the shoulder of the county road, engines ticking in the cold, waiting their turn like it was Sunday service at the Methodist Church. I want to tell you how a scrawny operation 11 miles outside Millard's Junction, Missouri, 31 acres my grandfather bought in 1938 for $1,100, mortgaged twice since, and once more by me, went from a mess of underweight shoats nobody would touch, to the reason a man like that stood in my yard with his hat in his hand, waiting his turn behind a line of trucks. Because 6 months earlier I couldn't have given those hogs away. I owed the Caldwell County Farmers Bank $1,840 on a note my grandfather signed before he died, and the feed corn alone was running me broke, 60 cents a bushel and climbing, and my herd of 41 animals eating like it was going out of style and putting on no weight worth mentioning. I want to tell you about a woman named Loretta Voss who ran a bakery on 3rd Street in town, and about the 6 dozen loaves of bread she threw in the trash barrel behind her shop every single night because nobody would buy day-old. I want to tell you about a ledger I found in the bottom drawer of an old roll-top desk, water-stained and half-eaten by mice, with my grandfather's handwriting in it going back to 1946. But mostly, I want to tell you that everybody standing in that yard on the 7th of October, the butcher, the bank, the neighbors who'd been waiting since spring to buy this place out from under me, every one of them was wrong about what a farm needs to survive. It doesn't need money. It needs somebody willing to look at what everybody else calls garbage and see feed. That morning didn't start with me. It started with him, my grandfather, 23 years before I was ever born to this land. My grandfather died on a Tuesday, the 9th of February, 1960. Out in the east lot with a bucket of shelled corn still in his hand. Doc Ramsey said his heart quit before he hit the ground. Said it was quick. Said that like it was supposed to help. I was the one who found him, 40 minutes later, because I'd been in the barn arguing with a sow who didn't want to farrow, and by the time I came looking for him, the corn had already spilled out into the mud, and the hogs had eaten most of it off his coat sleeve. I was 18 years old, and I had never once in my life balanced a checkbook. The funeral was small. Pastor Dillard from the Methodist Church, maybe 30 people, most of them neighbors who came more for the ham sandwiches after than for him. Though I don't say that with any bitterness. That's just how it is in a county like ours. My grandmother had been gone 6 years by then, my father before that, killed in a truck accident on Route 9 when I was 11, and my mother had remarried and moved to Springfield and didn't much care to be reminded she still had a son farming 80 acres of Caldwell County dirt. So when the will got read out in Mr. Halloran's office above the drugstore, there wasn't a long line of people to hear it. There was me, and there was the 80 acres, and there were 41 Duroc hogs, thin as fence posts, and there was a note at First State Bank of Caldwell for $2,300 that my grandfather had taken out the spring before to put a new roof on the hog barn and had not gotten around to paying down. Mr. Vance at the bank was not unkind about it, not exactly. He had known my grandfather 30 years, but he sat behind that big oak desk with his fountain pen capped and uncapped in his fingers and told me that a boy my age inheriting a debt like that was, in his words, a situation the bank would need to monitor closely. He said it slow, The way you'd talk to somebody you didn't expect to understand you the first time. I told him I intended to pay it. He said he hoped so, and wrote something down on a card, and that was that. I walked home the 4 miles from town because the truck needed a fuel pump I couldn't afford yet, and I remember it was cold enough that my breath hung in front of me the whole way, and I remember thinking that 80 acres had never in my life felt so much like a debt, and so little like a home. The hogs met me at the fence when I got there, the way they always did, expecting corn I didn't have enough of to last the month. The fuel pump came from Hutchins Farm Supply in town, $9.40. Money I peeled off what I'd meant for seed corn, and once the truck ran again, I drove back to see Mr. Vance on a Tuesday, the 14th of February, 1961, because the note was 3 weeks past due, and I thought a man might listen better to a boy who showed up in a running vehicle, instead of one who walked 4 miles in the cold to beg. He didn't listen better. He had the ledger card out before I sat down, like he'd been expecting me, and had already decided the shape of the conversation. Caldwell County Farmers Bank had carried worse debts than mine, he said, but rarely from an 18-year-old with no father, no uncle, no grown man's name, to co-sign against the risk. He said it without raising his voice, which somehow made it land harder than shouting would have. He said boys took over operations like this one every few years in this county, hogs mostly, sometimes dairy, and inside of 2 seasons the bank was foreclosing on stock that had gone thin and sick because a kid didn't know feed conversion from a hole in the ground. He wasn't trying to be cruel about it. He said my grandfather had been a careful man, and careful men left behind operations that could be run into the dirt by somebody who didn't understand what they were looking at. I told him I understood pigs. He said understanding pigs and understanding debt were 2 different educations, and the bank could not extend the note, could not lower the monthly figure, could not do anything but expect the March payment in full or begin the process of taking the deed as security, which he said, the way he might have mentioned the weather. I don't remember what I said back. I remember the drive home better than the words. 7 miles of gravel county road, with the heater in that truck barely working, frost still thick along the fence lines even though it was past noon, and a stack of unpaid slips in the glove box that I didn't need to open to recite, Ferguson Feed and Grain, $41 owed since December. Hutchins Farm Supply, the fuel pump, plus a battery I hadn't paid off yet. The vet in Milford, who'd wormed the sows in October, on credit I'd promised to make good by Christmas. I turned in at the mailbox and sat there a minute before pulling up to the house, looking at the barn like it was a stranger's barn, wondering what exactly I thought I was going to fill it with come spring, and how many months I had left to figure that out before somebody else's name went on the deed instead of mine. The letter from Caldwell Grain and Feed came Thursday, the 23rd of March, tucked between a seed catalog and a bill from the propane company, and it didn't waste any words being kind about it. Corn was going from $1.18 a bushel to $1.41, effective the 1st of April, on account of what the letter called regional supply conditions, which I took to mean somebody else's bad year had become mine too. I read it standing at the kitchen counter with my coat still on, and I read it again sitting down, and then I got the pencil out of the drawer where my grandfather had always kept it, and a sheet of the lined paper he used for nothing but grocery lists, and I started doing the arithmetic I'd been avoiding since the bank visit. 41 hogs left in the herd, down from 53 at Christmas, 6 sold at a loss, 6 more I didn't like to think about, eating roughly 4 pounds of grain a day apiece if I wanted them finishing out by fall instead of straggling into winter thin and worthless. That was 164 pounds a day across the herd, better than 2.5 bushels, which at the new price came to just under $3.60 a day in corn alone. I multiplied it out to a week, then to a month, then made myself do the whole summer, May through September, 5 months. Call it 150 days, and the number that came up at the bottom of the page was $540, give or take, just for corn, on top of what I already owed Ferguson's and Hutchins and the vet in Milford. I sat there a long time with that number in front of me. The stove ticked as it cooled. Somewhere out past the porch, one of the sows was working herself up about something, that low, rolling complaint they get when the trough's been empty too long, and I didn't move to see about it right away, which wasn't like me. I just looked at the paper like it might correct itself if I stared hard enough, the way you look at a fence post you've walked past every day for years and suddenly can't remember if it was always leaning. $540 I did not have, on top of the note the banker had made sound like weather. I thought about selling down the herd further, 30 head, 25, but a smaller herd wasn't going to make the bank payment either, and I already knew what thin margins looked like from the wrong side. I folded the paper in half, then in half again, and put it under the sugar bowl where I kept things I needed to look at again, but couldn't stand to look at just then, and I went out to see about the sow, because whatever else was true, she still needed feeding today, price or no price. Sadie quieted once I dumped the last of the cracked corn in the trough, but I stood there after, watching her eat like the answer might be in the way she chewed, and it wasn't. 14 miles to the county seat felt longer that morning than it ever had, the truck's heater doing nothing against a windshield fogged at the edges, frost still holding in the ditches, even though it was nearly 10. I hadn't planned what I'd say. I only knew I couldn't pay $540 for feed corn I didn't have, and a man who can't pay for one thing has to go looking for another thing to trade instead. The bakery sat on the corner across from the feed store, a narrow brick building with flour dust ghosting the front window glass, and a bell over the door that rang thin and a little cracked. She was behind the counter when I came in, an older woman, gray hair pinned back tight, flour to her elbows, and she looked at me the way people in town had gotten used to looking at me since the funeral, like she was deciding how much of my time was worth her patience. I told her plain what I needed, which wasn't bread exactly, not yet. I told her I'd heard she threw out what didn't sell, and I asked if that was true. She set down whatever she'd been kneading and studied me a good long moment before she answered, the kind of look that goes past what you're saying to what you're not. Every night, she said. Health department makes her toss anything past a day old, whether it's gone stale or not, loaves, rolls, the ends of things that never made it into a bag. Goes in the bin out back. Has for years. Waste, she called it, and said the word like it cost her something to say. I asked if I could haul it instead of her paying to have it hauled, and take it off her hands for good, free, so long as she didn't mind me coming by regular. For what? She said. Hogs, I told her. I've got hogs and no corn money, and bread's got to be worth something to something. She didn't laugh at that, which I'd half expected, and she didn't say yes right off either. She wiped her hands on her apron and came around the counter to get a better look at me, like she was pricing a piece of furniture, and asked how old I was, and when I told her 18, she made a sound low in her throat that wasn't quite disbelief and wasn't quite approval. Come by tonight after close, she said. See what you're asking for before you go making promises to animals you can't keep. I said I would, and thanked her, and went back out past the bell that rang the same thin note on the way out as it had going in, the cold outside sharper now than it had been, like something had shifted while I was inside and I hadn't felt it happen yet. She was true to her word that night, and true to it every night after. I came by after close with the truck bed lined in old feed sacks, and she'd have the bread waiting in flour barrels by the back door, loaves gone hard as shingles, rolls sunk in on themselves, the odd birthday cake nobody had picked up, gone stale under its own frosting. Wednesday, December the 14th, I hauled out 4 barrels. By the following Monday, it was 6, and she'd started setting aside the burnt batches too, the ones she used to feed the trash man for a nickel a bag. The hogs took to it the way I'd hoped, and better. I broke the loaves up by hand in the trough, and they came at it like they hadn't eaten in a week, Delilah shouldering the barrows aside same as always, the whole pen loud with it, that wet grinding sound of 30-some hogs working their jaws. For the first few days I felt near foolish with relief. free feed, and they liked it. And Mr. Halloran couldn't say a word against a program that cost me nothing but gasoline and my own 2 hands. But bread's got no backbone to it. That's what I didn't understand yet, though some part of me felt it before I could have said it plain. 3 weeks in, I started weighing what I could by eye and by the tape my grandfather used to keep hung on a nail by the scale, and the numbers weren't moving right. Delilah held her weight fine. She'd hold weight through a drought. But the younger ones, the March litter, they were putting on some flesh and then losing it. Fat 1 week and gaunt the next, like the bread filled their bellies without ever quite feeding them. I'd stand at the fence some mornings with the frost still silvering the rail and watch them and not be able to say what was wrong except that something was wrong, the way you know a truck's running rough before you can name the cylinder. I asked Mr. Kessler at the feed store about it, careful not to let on I wasn't buying corn from him regular anymore, and he said bread's mostly air and water once a hog's through with it. Said I'd want to cut it with something, mash or middlings, something with weight to it. I didn't have money for middlings any more than I had money for corn. I went home that night and sat at the kitchen table with the tape measure and a stub of pencil, and did sums that came out wrong 3 times running, and it was somewhere in the middle of the 3rd try, frustrated enough to want to put my fist through the wall, that I thought of the loft. I hadn't been up there since the funeral. There wasn't any reason to have gone. The ladder to the loft was the same one it had always been, rungs worn pale in the middle where 3 generations of boots had climbed it, and it took my weight the way it always had, which surprised me some, given how long it had sat unclimbed. I went up with the lantern because the loft window had been boarded since a hailstorm in '54, and there wasn't any other light to speak of. I was after harness leather, nothing more than that. A set of old draft collars I remembered from being small, the kind of cracked, oiled leather that a saddler in the next county would still give you 40 cents a pound for if the buckles were brass and not pot metal. 40 cents a pound wasn't nothing. I figured if there were 15-20 pounds of usable leather up there, that was near enough to a bag of middlings, and a bag of middlings was near enough to keep those hogs from looking gaunt 1 more week. The collars were where I remembered them, hanging off a beam nail gone orange with rust, and I was working one loose when my boot caught the corner of a trunk I didn't remember and near put me on my back. It was an old feed store crate, Purina stamped faded blue on the side, and inside it, under a wool horse blanket eaten through with moth, was a book. Not a Bible, not a hymnal, a ledger, black leather gone soft and cracked at the spine, like something carried in a coat pocket for years before it was ever set down. My grandfather's hand was on the flyleaf, the same slow, careful hand that used to sign the church pledge cards, and under his name a date, 1932. I sat down right there on the crate with the lantern between my knees and started reading, and it wasn't accounts the way I expected, not just dollars and cents, it was hogs. Weights, dates, what he'd fed them and when, and there, maybe 8 pages in ink gone brown as tobacco, a recipe, if you could call it that, day-old bread from the Methodist church suppers he'd written, mixed with skim milk off the top of the separator and whatever oats weren't fit for the horses. Corn too dear this season, he'd written under it, small and flat, like a man admitting something he didn't want admitted. Fed the Hendricks bread-bill hogs on this all winter, dressed heavier than the corn-fed ones come March. I read that line 3 times before it settled all the way down into me. My hands had gone cold, and it wasn't only the loft. I kept reading past that page, and the entries went on through February and into March of 1933. Weights climbing where they had no business climbing, a man stretching a bad year into something that fed his family. Then, near the back, tucked between 2 pages that had stuck together with age, a letter, folded in thirds, from the Caldwell County Farmers State Bank. Notice of deficiency, it said across the top, dated the 9th of January, 1933. The amount owed was $412, a number that would have bought 2 good draft teams that year, and at the bottom, in a different hand than my grandfather's, a note scrawled sideways in the margin, extension granted 90 days, pending inspection of stock condition. I sat with that a long time before I understood what I was looking at. He hadn't just had a rough winter, he'd nearly lost the place, same as I was standing to lose it now. Same bank. Near enough the same number if you adjusted for the years between. I rode over to Earl Whitfield's the next morning, a Thursday, the 11th of May, because Earl had farmed hogs longer than anybody left breathing in that end of the county, and he'd known my grandfather from the Grange Hall days. Earl was working on a hinge on his hog house door when I got there, didn't even look up right away. "Your granddad," he said, once I'd asked, "come about as close to losing that farm as a man can come without actually losing it. 33. Bad corn crop, bad prices, bank breathing down everybody's neck same as now." He straightened up, wiped his hands on his trousers. What saved him wasn't luck. Man drove his truck to every church supper, every diner, every place throwing out scraps for free, and he fed it to hogs nobody thought was worth feeding. Folks laughed at him for it, called it beggar's pork. Earl looked at me then, steady, wasn't laughing come fall. His hogs dressed out better than corn-fed stock 3 counties over. Whole county remembered it for years, then forgot it. Way people do. I stood there in his yard with the sun coming up warm on the back of my neck, and I thought about the flour sack, the bread going stale behind the bakery every night, the ledger sitting in my coat pocket like it had waited 30 years for somebody to need it exactly this bad. It wasn't about grain. It never had been. It was about what a man was willing to pick up off the ground that everybody else stepped over. I drove home with the ledger on the seat beside me, the pages open to the entry I'd read 40 times already. Skim milk, 4 gallons to every bushel of ground oats, mixed wet with the bread until it held together like dough. My grandfather's handwriting got smaller toward the bottom of the page, like he'd been figuring costs right there in the barn, pencil against his knee. Monday, June 6th, 1960. I drove to the Halverson place, 3 miles east on County Road 9, and asked Artis Halverson what she'd take for skim milk, the stuff she usually poured down the drain after the cream came off. She looked at me like I'd asked her something indecent, then named a price so low I wrote it down twice to make sure I hadn't misheard her. 2 cents a gallon. I bought 40 gallons that first week, and she said she'd have more Thursday. I ground the oats myself on the old mill in the corn crib, the one my grandfather bought secondhand from an implement dealer in Marshalltown back in '48, belt slipping every third turn until I tightened it with a leather punch and a spare hole. Wednesday night, I mixed the first batch in the trough behind the barn, bread soaked soft, milk poured over, oats stirred through until the whole mess smelled sweet and sour at once, like a bakery and a dairy had an argument, and this was what settled it. The hogs didn't trust it at first. Duchess sniffed it, backed off, came around again the way she does with anything new. Then she put her snout in and didn't lift her head for a full 2 minutes, and after that, the rest of them came at it like they'd been starved for a month, which, in a manner of speaking, they had been, on the thin corn ration I'd been stretching since March. I started weighing them Friday mornings, before feeding, the way the ledger said to, a scale I borrowed off Delbert Pruitt for $2 a month, the platform kind with the sliding weight bar. I wrote the numbers in my own notebook, a 5-cent composition book from the drugstore in town, 1 page per hog, name and date and pounds, Duchess, Clementine, the boar I never did name because my grandfather never named his either. 12 days in, Duchess had put on 11 pounds. I read the number 3 times before I believed the pencil. I didn't tell anybody at first, not even the fellow at the feed co-op who still asked, every time I came in for salt block or wormer, whether I'd finally come to my senses about that operation. I just kept driving to the bakery every night around 8, kept driving to Halverson's every Monday and Thursday, kept mixing the trough by lantern light with my sleeves rolled up, and kept writing the numbers down like they were something I might need to prove to a judge someday. By the first week of July, the notebook had a column I hadn't planned on, a line at the bottom of each page where I started writing, almost without meaning to, ahead of last year. The Caldwell County Fair weigh-in fell on a Saturday, the 9th of August, 1960, and I got there before 6 with Duchess and 2 of her littermates loaded in a borrowed trailer, the metal still cool from the night before. The fairgrounds smelled like sawdust and diesel and frying dough from the concession stand that wasn't even open yet. I'd never entered anything in my life. My grandfather had, every year for 30-some years, and there was a shelf in the front room with 3 faded ribbons on it, blue gone the color of an old bruise. Orville Kessler was there with his boys and 6 hogs off his own corn ration, hogs that had cost him, by his own bragging to anyone standing nearby, better than 11 cents a pound to raise. He looked at my trailer the way a man looks at a used car he already knows he isn't buying. Said something to his oldest about bread and pigs that I let go past me like weather. The scale was the big platform kind, county-owned, calibrated the week before by a man from Springfield who signed his name in a book. Duchess went up first. She didn't fuss, which surprised me. She'd fussed at everything her whole life. She just stood there on the steel plate, blinking in the early light, while the man in the gray coveralls slid the weight bar down the beam, notch by notch, and then held it, frowning, and slid it again. 231 pounds. I heard somebody behind me say that number out loud, like they didn't believe the man had read it right, and the man in the coveralls read it again, same voice, same number, and wrote it on his clipboard. Kessler's best hog, a barrow he'd been talking about since June, went 219. The judge, a county extension agent with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, ran his hand along Duchess's back and said something about finish, about marbling you could see just in the fat line without even cutting, and one of the fair board women wrote that down too. Nobody clapped. It wasn't that kind of crowd. But I noticed the quiet had a different shape to it than the quiet before, the kind where men who'd been leaning on the rail straightened up a little, and one fellow I didn't know leaned toward his neighbor and said, "Lo, whose operation is that?" And the neighbor said my grandfather's name first, then caught himself, and said mine. Kessler didn't say anything to me at all. He looked at the scale, then at his boy, then walked off toward the cattle barn like he had business there, though I never saw him go inside it. I stood by the rail with my own clipboard, the drugstore notebook folded in my back pocket, and wrote the number down before I let myself feel anything about it. Word travels slower than people think, in a county that size. It doesn't move like a telephone line, straight and fast. It moves like water through a field after rain, finding the low places first. By the 3rd week of October, 1960, the low place it found was Millard's Meats on Route 9, where a man who'd once looked at me over his reading glasses and said he didn't buy from boys sent his nephew out with a truck to look at 4 hogs I had ready. The nephew didn't say much. He weighed them, he pressed his thumb along the loin the way the extension judge had, and he wrote a number on a slip of paper that was 11 cents a pound better than what I'd been getting hauling to Marchetti's in Kirkwood, 22 miles the other direction. I didn't ask why. I loaded the truck and let the silence answer for both of us. By January, the elder Millard came himself. Cold enough that morning the water trough had a skin of ice on it before 8, and he stood at the fence in a canvas coat with his hands jammed in the pockets, watching the hogs work the trough where I dumped the bread and the milk oat slurry together, steam coming off it in the air. He didn't say the thing men say when they're wrong. He just asked what I was feeding them, and I told him, plain, the way my grandfather would have, day-old bread from the bakery in town, ground oats, skim milk, and he nodded, like it confirmed something he'd already worked out in his own head on the drive over. He started buying regular that spring. Not every week at first, then every week. Then, by April, ahead of anybody else on the route. The bakery came near to closing that same winter. I heard it before I saw it, the way you hear most things, secondhand at the feed store, a man saying her furnace had gone, and the bank in Caldwell wasn't in a mood to carry a widow's shop through repairs. I drove in on a Thursday I wasn't scheduled to, and found her in the back with a lantern instead of the overhead lights, flour dust hanging in the cold air, like something suspended, refusing to say much about it. She still had the sacks loaded for me before I asked. I told her she didn't have to, not that week, not with what she was carrying. She said the bread was going out one way or another, might as well be to something that used it, and turned back to the ovens like the conversation was finished. It wasn't charity by then, and it wasn't a bargain either. It had turned into something with no clean word for it, the kind of arrangement that doesn't get written into any ledger, though I found myself, some nights, wishing my grandfather had a page for it, a place where you write down what you owe a person that isn't money. I paid off the note on a Tuesday in October of 1961, standing at the counter of the Caldwell County Farmers Bank with a check. The manager counted twice before he believed it. 18 months ahead of the schedule he'd written up 2 years before, with the look of a man doing me a favor by not laughing. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. I remembered the first time I'd walked in there, 17 years old, with my father's coat still smelling like someone else's shoulders, and how he'd talked past me to nobody in particular about how the place would likely go to auction by spring. Spring had come and gone 4 times since then. I didn't remind him. Some things don't need saying twice to matter. That same week, I took the flour sack down from where it had sat folded on the smokehouse shelf since the day I found it, stiff with age, my grandfather's hand still visible in the crease where he'd pressed cracklings into it 100 times over. I got a hammer and 2 nails and put it up on the inside of the smokehouse door, where nobody would see it who wasn't looking for it, where it would catch the light for a second each time the door swung open and then go dark again. Not a trophy, just a reminder, the way a scar is a reminder, that the ground under a place doesn't change, even when everything standing on it does. The bakery still sends bread twice a week, though there's talk now of the 2 operations working the same land come next spring, an arrangement neither of us has bothered to put a name to, because some partnerships don't need one. The butcher still comes Tuesdays and Fridays, first in line, same as he has since the fall. The hogs came in heavier and sweeter than anything else brought to that scale, and he's never once mentioned the year he told me a boy couldn't run a place like this into anything but the ground. I think sometimes about how close I came to selling out before I ever opened that drawer in the back room, how many men my age let the weight of a debt talk them out of looking harder at what they already owned. There's a ledger like that in somebody's barn right now, or a jar in somebody's cellar, or a notebook nobody's cracked since a funeral. It's not always gold. Sometimes it's bread nobody wanted, or a note about milk and oats written in pencil gone soft with age. You don't know what you're standing on until you go looking. If there's something like that in your family, a drawer nobody's opened, a story nobody's told, I'd like to hear it. Write it in the comments. And if this one was worth your time, stay a while longer. There's more where this came from.